So the next section is about inverses. So the first thing that we're going to ask is, what is an inverse function? So what is an inverse? So the idea of an inverse is that a function, you give an input and it gives you an output. So it's kind of like a machine. So I hand it something, it gives me something back. An inverse asks the opposite question. So it tells you what was the result, and then you tell me what you put into the machine. So that's what an inverse does. So if you think about the picture, here's my domain of f. Over here is my range of f. I have this x that's kind of going to this y. I have this m. It's going over here to this n. So this is how f works. F takes something in its domain and goes to its range. F inverse says, now this was the result, what mapped to it? So F inverse goes the opposite direction. So in this picture, what we would say is that f of x was y. That was, here's the input, what was the output? That means that f inverse of y is x. So it's asking the question, the result was y, what was my input? That was x. Also, f of m, that was n, because if I start at m and I put it into the machine f, I get out n. That means that f inverse of n would be m. So in the range I had an n, what mapped to it? That would be m. So they go back and forth. We could also represent this in a table. So let's say that my inputs are 1, 2, 3, and 4, and my outputs are 1, 4, 2, and 3. Okay, so first off, what is f of 2? Well, let's see, that's saying the function f, I input a 2, what's my output? That would be 4. What about f of 1? Well, if I input a 1, I get out a 1, so f of 1 is 1. What about f inverse of 2? This is asking my output was 2, what was the original input? That would be 3. What about f inverse of 4? Well, now the output is 4, what was my original input? That would be 2. So you always, for the inverse, you always look at the original output and ask what input was originally mapped to it. As far as domain goes, if d sub f is the domain of f, then d sub f is the range of f inverse. So what does this mean? Go back up to our picture. Here, this was my domain of f. F inverse is going from the range over to this domain, so this is the range of f inverse. If r sub f is the range of f, then r sub f is the domain of f inverse, which this is how we denote it. Now what does that mean? If you go back up to my picture, what am I putting into the inverse? I'm putting in everything from this set over here, and that was the range of f. Alternately, if you want to write this, maybe shorthand, the domain of f is the range of the inverse. The range of f is the domain of the inverse. So they kind of switch, which makes sense in the picture. This is the domain of f, and this is the range of f, and the inverse is going the opposite direction. This is where I start, so that's the domain. This is where I finish, so that's the range. Let's try one more example here. So in the example that we did finding the inverse, I gave you a table. But what if I don't give you a table? What if I say f of x is 2x minus 3, and I ask the question, what is f inverse of 2? So that's saying that my output was 2, what was my original x? So to answer this question, I'll just set my function equal to 2, and I'll say which x gave me 2 as my output. So I'll add 1 to both sides, divide by 2. So this gives me 3 halves. That means that when I plugged in 3 halves to my original function, my result was 2. Therefore, f inverse of 2 is 3/2. And this is because f of 3/2 was 2. So that's what you kind of want to think. Let's do one more of these. How about f of x is x cubed minus 3? What is f inverse of 5? So now I'm saying which x value gave me 5 as my output. So I'll set my function equal to 5 and solve for x. So I'll add 3 to both sides. X cubed is 8. Take the cube root. How many cube roots are there? Well, 3 is an odd number, so whenever I have an odd power, I'm taking the cube root, there's only 1. So x has to be 2. The only time you have 2 answers is when I have an even root. So that tells me that f inverse of 5 is 2. And this is because f of 2 was 5. This is what we just solved for. So whenever you're trying to find an inverse, if you're given a table, work backwards. Start with your range, go back to your domain. If you're given a function and you want to know the inverse, you set the function equal to that number and solve for x.